On this special edition of FreightWaves Now, we have two guests. Chris Henry, the program manager for the Truckload Carriers Association Profitability Program, known as TPP, and Jack Porter, the managing director of TPP. Well, thank you guys for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Now, well, starting out, the software platform of TCA Engage kind of compares a few things. Talk about what those are.
Yeah, it compares a lot of things. So it allows companies, trucking companies of all sizes, types, and modes to compare their financial and operational performance over whatever interval of time they wish. So it allows them to truly understand how they're doing relative to a group of high-performing carriers.
And you guys were telling me you have good carriers in this program and you have great carriers, because a lot of people who want to be a part of this already are great businesses. Talk about that.
Well, I mean, it's part of the sort of transition of the company itself, because trucking companies have inherently tried to figure out what their best practices are, their benchmark, et cetera. So when we first started the benchmarking, the TPP program at TCA, it was mainly a bunch of carriers that wanted to make themselves better, but they had nothing to compare against. So when we started introducing benchmarks and then we introduced the platform, it gave these carriers the opportunity to compare and contrast real-time data in their own market and in their own business to figure out which things they do best. So it's the next level of probably high-performing companies, is to identify the benchmarks that are across the industry, not just within your own company.
You guys have these numbers, you have this data, so what defines the best truckload performers? What makes up it can't just be one thing, so what are the multiple things that go into that?
Well, I'll start with the culture. So our population is skewed because these companies just want to get better. So when people say, how are your carriers performing versus the population or the general population, we don't really know. We can just assume that they're doing much better. But a common denominator with all of them is they want to get better, and they start with a good culture. So they're big on safety, they're big on development of their workforce, whether they're drivers or non-drivers. So that would be the first kind of common denominator.
And quite honestly, there's quite a few yardsticks inside this industry that really identifies high performers. You could be a high performer in safety, you could be a high performer in just plain operations, you could be a high performer in net profit. All those become part and parcel of this comparisons, but quite honestly, most of these people have got a very, very strong culture, and they're living in an industry, quite honestly, has got what one of my clients always tells me is that they live in an industry where they've got supermarket returns and Nassau risk. So everything they do has got to be fairly well calculated. And the idea of what the benchmarks lead to the best practices is probably the key to the program.
What size carriers are we talking about? Are we talking about 800 to 1,000 trucks, 20 trucks? What are we looking at?
Yeah, our average size currently is 162.
Okay.
Our smallest carrier in our program is 13 tractors, and our largest is about 7,000. So there's a wide variety of sizes within our program, but the average would be the 162. So the mid-size fleet for North America.
And it's actually a good question, because when we first started the program, we thought size would be one of those things that carriers would sort of get themselves to a certain group of folks. And what we've seen in the past is basically all sizes come up with different types of best practices. So oftentimes a 7,000 truck carrier might be having, a whole bunch, 70, 100 truck carriers inside their walls. So they learn from each other. And the reality is that the size hasn't made a lot of difference. Mode has. Van carriers like to be with van carriers. Refrigerator carriers like to be refrigerator carriers, and flatbed guys like to be a flatbed guys.
Yeah, and our latest cohort is brokerage. So we've started a brokerage-based group that's proven pretty popular. It's probably been the quickest growing program in our history. So that's another area that we're diving into currently.
And going back to, you talked about culture. Does that also have to do with driver retention? We talk about this driver shortage, not finding the right types of people. How do these people that are these great carriers keep their great drivers?
Well, I think the main thing is everyone has to be marching to the same common goal. Safety is a great one, because everyone benefits from having a safe culture, whether you're a driver or non-driver. So the smart companies understand that retention starts with culture and doing what you say you're going to do, and keeping your drivers safe, keeping your non-drivers safe. That's a good first step.
In your database, you have good performers. How do you make those good performers great? What things should they change to become a great carrier?
Oftentimes inside the program, it's just playing their competitiveness. I mean, every business guy, and these are privately held companies, usually family run, so they're competitiveness within each other, and how they operate on a number of different situations. That could be their operating ratio, could be their retention for good drivers, et cetera. And that's the core of that culture making a difference. Oftentimes you'll talk to these companies that, we're driver focused. Well, we have an open door policy. We have all these types of things that basically we have data inside our organization that can sort of prove that either true or false, and either you should be working on it or you're pretty good at it. But there's a lot of moving parts inside these companies, and unfortunately, oftentimes drivers are transient to start with, and to have a really strong culture, you have to sort of go above and beyond just checking a few boxes.
Talking about financials, this is a tough industry. I mean, we've been talking for weeks about this freight recession, about a soft market. How do you succeed financially? What have you guys seen?
Yeah, you have to have a certain makeup to withstand the roller coaster, which can be your profitability or lack of profitability in any given season or month. So it takes a lot of courage to be into trucking because the returns are historically pretty low. But just probably the thing that's emerging the most, small, mid, and large carriers, is being able to understand and be data driven. So being able to react to trends before your competitors do, that's something that's separating the top performers from the average, and that's going to be an emerging trend and growing over time.
And right now you have a lot. How many companies do you have in your database?
We have 205 company profiles, so that is either distinct entities or divisions of a larger carrier. So in total, 205 and growing. Within our what we call the best practice groups, the groups that get together and share best ideas and practices, there's about 110 companies throughout North America. So this isn't just the United States, it includes Canadian companies as well.
Companies watching, can they join? Can they become a part of this?
Absolutely, yeah. So they'll get involved in our online benchmarking first. So the natural evolution after seeing how they're performing, what we call the what stage, is how. How do we get better? And the natural evolution is get involved in one of those best practice groups and understand what these peer groups are doing to make better decisions. That's the natural progression.
And you could touch on this, Jack, you guys talked about being data driven and kind of being ahead of the curve, helping make these good companies, these good carriers great. Talk about that.
Well, they work within somewhat of a void. It's 17% of the GDP, and there's so many people involved in this situations that trucking companies, almost the best in class, are service oriented. They really want to do two service things: be service to their customers and service to their drivers. And unfortunately, when the market goes volatile both ways, the real definition of on-time service and what service really means to that shipper or that end customer is not really defined until you maybe move or try something different. So the second part of that whole scenario becomes, how do I keep the stability and my costs in line to take care of these situations? And 18 was a perfect example where much of what we saw in our data was a lot of the return on investments and the operating ratios and the net profits were improving for the trucking companies. At the same time, they're reinvesting in driver pay, and they're reinvesting in shop, in maintenance, and some of the things that are going on inside their variable costs. So by the end of the year, they had basically spent most of that increases they had. And now the market becomes more volatile than any market I've ever seen. And now that change becomes, how do we actually supply that to the marketplace? So I think the key to profitability in the trucking world has got some real headwinds. One of them is we have a very disparate marketplace with lots of 1 to 5 carriers that are family run, doing their thing in a marketplace that oftentimes can change prices fairly volatilely. Now that's where FreightWaves comes in, where they basically overlay near-term information that can sort of readjust and take advantage of some of the long-term sort of strategies any company might have.
You're talking about sonar in those terms, yep.
Yep. Because we're now getting valid information in the marketplace today that's not just tribal knowledge or gut feeling that's been that way for the last 50 years in trucking.
Well, thank you, Chris and Jack, for being here. Obviously, a lot goes into being the best truckload performers, not just one thing, many factors. Thank you guys for joining us for this special Friday edition of FreightWaves Now. As always, share the love. You are watching on YouTube, but follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We'll see you next week.